For decades, governments around the world operated on an invisible social contract. Older generations told younger generations that if you study hard, work honestly, respect institutions, and trust democracy, eventually life will improve. This promise created stability. Even when people struggled financially, they still believed progress was still possible. But Gen Z is the first globally connected generation that can compare reality instantly. And what many young people discovered terrified them. The promises no longer matched reality. Welcome to Earth in Ecstasy, where we talk about the lives of life on Earth and how it feels like to live at this very present moment. Tonight, we are diving deep into the rise of Cockroach Janta Party, the online rebellion against political corruption, the anger towards BJP and established politics, and the growing divide between the older and younger generations, and why Gen Z across the world may be entering its first truly global political awakening. This is not just about memes, this is about survival. And by the end of this video, you may realize that the internet generation is no longer asking for permission to change the system. They are preparing to challenge it directly. Let's start in India because India may currently be experiencing one of the most explosive examples of digital political rebellion anywhere in the world. The trigger was a single word.
Here, youngsters like cockroaches get
Cockroaches. After controversial remarks associated with unemployed youth and critics of institutions, the insults spread online quickly. But instead of rejecting the term, India's Gen Z transformed it into a political symbolism. And that is where the Cockroach Janta Party, the CJP, was born. Now, understand this carefully. The CJP is not important because of the name. It is important because of the name it represents psychologically. The cockroach became symbolic of survival inside toxic systems. A creature that survives pressure, survives collapse, survives poison, survives neglect. That symbolism resonated deeply with millions of young Indians who increasingly feel abandoned by the system around them. And within days, the movement exploded across social media. And memes, manifestos, volunteer groups, political satire, digital activism, and public outrage all began all together. What started as an internet irony suddenly became national political discussion, and the ruling establishment noticed it immediately. That this movement did not appear from nowhere, it was building for years. India has one of the largest youth populations on earth. More than 65% of the population is under 35 years old, and this should be the India's greatest advantage. But somehow, instead, many young Indians increasingly feel trapped. Degrees no longer guarantee jobs. Government exams become endless cycles of uncertainty. Recruitment demands stretch for years. Paper leak scandals destroy trust. Urban living costs rise faster than salaries, and millions of educated youth now compete for tiny numbers of stable opportunities. This created something politically dangerous. A generation educated enough to recognize systematic problems but economically frustrated enough to feel powerless inside them. The frustration became the fuel behind CJP. Now, here is where the political conflict intensifies. The movement heavily criticizes the BJP. And to understand why, we need to understand what happens when one political force dominates a country for a long time. Because the BJP became one of the most powerful political organizations in the modern Indian history. Supporters credit the party for infrastructure growth, digital governance, international diplomacy, military positioning, welfare expansion, and national identity consolidation. Meanwhile, the critics abused BJP of over-centralization, religious polarization, media pressure, and free speech concerns, and failing to solve unemployment quickly enough. Because BJP has government nationally for years, every economic frustration eventually lands on them politically. Inflation, the ruling government gets blamed. Youth unemployment, the ruling government gets blamed. Institutional distrust, the ruling government gets blamed. That does not automatically make every criticism correct, but politically dominant parties always absorb public anger first, and Gen Z expresses anger differently than any other generation. Older generations were shaped by television, newspaper, local party networks, religious blocs, and political loyalty inherited by families. But Gen Z has Gen Z has been shaped by algorithms, memes, viral videos, YouTube investigations, live streams, Reddit threads, and decentralized online communities. This completely transformed the political communication because Gen Z no longer waits for permission to create narratives, they create their own. A single meme can now outperform television news. A single viral clip can embarrass national politicians. A hashtag can become political pressure overnight. And that is exactly what terrified traditional political systems are afraid of. Because for years, BJP itself mastered digital politics better than almost any other political force in India. Its online communication networks became legendary, but CJP turned the same internet culture against the establishment itself, not through traditional activism, through humor. Because satire became weaponized. A protest can be suppressed, a meme spreads uncontrollably, and that is why the movement expanded so rapidly. Because AP News described it as satire transforming into broader political frustration. At the center of the storm stood Abhijit Dipke. Reports describe him as political communications strategist who rapidly transformed online outrage into organized branding and manifesto politics. Within days, logos appeared, manifestos spread, and membership systems launched, and slogans flooded social media. Supporters called it revolutionary political awakening, while critics called it engineered digital propaganda. Some online discussions even questioned whether the movement's growth was partially algorithmically amplified. But regardless of how the movement spread, one reality became undeniable. The anger behind it was real, and then came the manifesto. This changed everything because suddenly the movement stopped looking like a random internet rebellion and it started looking political. The manifesto focused on judicial accountability, anti corruptional reforms, media transparency, women representation, electoral fairness, and opposition to any anonymous political funding. Notice something important? These were not calls for violent revolution, they were democratic reform demands. The distinct matters enormously because the movement framed itself around the democracy legally rather than destroying democracy itself. This is where Gen Z differs sharply from other political assumptions because older generations often believe that change required joining existing power structures. And Gen Z has increasingly become transparent and accountable. Now compare the major political ecosystems. The BJP represents centralized national power and large-scale governance identity. Aam Aadmi Party originally emerged through anti-corruption politics and outsider energy, while the NDA survives through coalition management and electoral alliances. The Gen Z has increasingly distrusted all political structures equally, not just one party. That may be most important transformation happening right now. Young voters are becoming less emotionally loyal to permanent political identities. Instead, they are evaluating politics through performance, transparency, employment and accountability, and institutional trust. And social media accelerated this process massively. Then something happened that intensified the conflict even further. The CJP account on X was reportedly withheld in India. Instantly, accusations of censorship exploded online. Critics argued this proved institutional intolerance towards satire and dissent. Supporters of the government argued online manipulation and political misinformation required scrutiny. And this reveals one of the biggest modern day political battles worldwide, the battle over digital speech itself, because whoever controls narratives increasingly controls political power. But this story does not end in India because the same generational frustration is spreading globally, especially across Europe. In Europe, the crisis looked different externally: higher wages, better infrastructure, stronger welfare systems, but psychologically, young Europeans are facing something deeply similar: the collapse of future confidence. In cities across Europe, housing became unaffordable, living costs exploded, and temporary unemployment increased. And economic optimism weakened because after
US Iran war.
inflation and energy crisis intensified pressure on younger generations. And slowly, many young Europeans began realizing something frightening. They may live worse than their parents. Historically, Europe's entire post-World War II stability depended on opposition expectation. Every generation was supposed to move upward economically, but Gen Z increasingly feels downward pressure instead. That psychological shift is politically explosive. In France, pension reform protests triggered massive demonstrations. Many young people argued they were being asked to financially support systems they may never fully benefit from themselves. In the UK, Gen Z increasingly expressed despair about housing affordability, student debt, inflation, and declining living standards. In Germany, younger voters increasingly shifted towards smaller ideological parties as trust in traditional structures weakened. Across Europe, the internet accelerated every conflict, exactly like India. This is the terrifying realization government worldwide are now facing. Gen Z is globally connected emotionally. A frustrated graduate in Delhi watches French pension protest. A British student sees Indian unemployment debates. A German activist follows American housing societies. For the first time in history, young generations compare systematic frustrations internationally in real time, digitally that too. And this creates a shared political psychology, not identical ideology, but shared emotional exhaustion. This is why movements like CGP matter beyond India, not because Europe is becoming the Cockroach Janta Party, but because symbolism translates internationally. Survival inside the system, people have increasingly started to distrust. That is why the cockroach metaphor became powerful, because Gen Z globally feels underestimated politically, ignored economically, and mocked culturally. Not every anti establishment movement improves society. History proves this repeatedly, because economic frustration can create reform. It can lead to extremism also. Europe itself already experienced the rise of far right populism, online radicalism, and hyperpolarization and misinformation ecosystems fueled by youth frustration. That is why democratic responsibility matters. And if Gen Z truly wants transformation, then the movement must remain peaceful, fact based, transparent, and legally accountable, institutionally constructive. Otherwise, the outrage eventually becomes chaos. And chaos historically strengthens authoritarianism rather than democracy. This may become the defining political question of the next decade. Can Gen Z move beyond protest and actually build systems better than the ones they criticize? Can they fight corruption without becoming corrupt themselves? Can they defend the free speech without enabling disinformation? Can they remain democratic while challenging powerful institutions? Can they transform governments legally rather than destructively? Because outrage alone cannot build nations, memes cannot run economies, virality cannot replace institutions, and real change requires policy, law, administration, educational reform, judicial accountability, economic planning, and long term transparency systems. This is the difficult part. But regardless of what happens next, the one thing that has already changed permanently is that Gen Z has crossed a psychological line. They are no longer politically passive. Perhaps this is why governments across the world are beginning to feel uneasy, because the generation once dismissed as lazy, distracted, addicted to phones and memes has started realizing the collective power. And when the largest digitally connected generation in human history begins questioning every institution simultaneously, the political world changes forever, I suppose. The truth is, this story was never really about cockroaches. It was about what happens when an entire generation feels ignored long enough that it begins turning mockery into identity, and identity into political resistance. India's Gen Z is not alone. From Delhi to Paris, from London to Berlin, young people everywhere beginning to question systems they once trusted blindly. Whether you support the BJP, oppose it, or support CJP, or reject the movement entirely, one thing has become impossible to deny: that the younger generation is no longer politically asleep. The internet changed that forever. For the first time in human history, billions of young people can witness corruption, hypocrisy, inequality, censorship, and political conflict in real time. And once people see the system clearly, they stop fearing it in the same way. But this is where the future becomes dangerous. Because anger alone cannot build nations, memes cannot replace governments, and outrage without responsibility eventually becomes destruction. If Gen Z truly believes that they can transform India and perhaps the world, then the challenge is no longer simply exposing broken systems. The real challenge is building better ones, legally, democratically, transparently, without becoming the very thing they once hated. That will decide whether this generation becomes another angry internet movement, or the generation that permanently reshaped democracy itself. And that is the greatest irony of all. The people are once mocked as cockroaches may become the people history remembers of surviving long enough to change everything. If you enjoyed this deep dive, subscribe to Earth and Ecstasy, leave your thoughts below, and tell us, is Gen Z beginning a democratic awakening, or are we watching the rise of another digital illusion? Until next time, stay curious, stay aware, and question everything.